My husband thought he caught me in a 15-year lie when he demanded a DNA test for our teenage son. He was expecting the doctor to hand him the ultimate proof of my infidelity, his golden ticket out of our marriage. Instead, the doctor handed us a 0% match for both of us. The boy I had raised wasn't his, but he wasn't mine either. The stainless steel fork hit the porcelain plate like a gunshot. The stainless steel fork hit the porcelain plate like a gunshot. Vance did not look up from his medium-rare steak. He simply wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, placed it perfectly parallel to his crystal glass of water, and said he wanted a paternity test for Julian. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that only exists in the sprawling manicured estates of the main line. Outside our dining room window, the sprawling lawn was swallowed by the dark, the perfectly trimmed hedges standing like silent guards around our stone house. Inside, the air turned to ice. I sat frozen at the opposite end of the long mahogany table. I did not drop my glass. I did not scream. I just stared at the man I had been married to for 16 years. Vance finally lifted his eyes to meet mine. They were flat, clinical, and entirely devoid of warmth. He looked at me not as a wife, but as a liability on a balance sheet. He calmly stated that Julian was 15 years old, that he looked nothing like him, and that he was tired of pretending he did not see the glaring differences. He said he had already booked the appointment at a private genetics clinic for Thursday morning. I was paralyzed. It was not guilt that pinned me to my chair, but the sheer, cold audacity of the accusation. I had never been unfaithful to Vance. Not once. Not in thought, not in action. I had sacrificed my own identity, my career, and my youth to build this pristine, flawless life for him. I had molded myself into the perfect corporate wife, hosting the right dinners, smiling at the right partners, and raising our son in this beautiful, sterile prison. And now, over a Tuesday night dinner, he was casually accusing me of a decade and a half of deceit. I found my voice, though it sounded like it belonged to someone else. I asked him if he was out of his mind. I asked him how he could look at the boy sleeping upstairs, the boy he had raised, and demand a swab of his cheek like a criminal suspect. Vance simply stood up, adjusted the cuffs of his tailored shirt, and said the numbers would speak for themselves. He walked out of the dining room, his leather shoes clicking against the hardwood floor, leaving me alone in the cavernous space. The next 3 days were a waking nightmare. I moved through the house like a ghost. I packed Julian his lunches, I drove him to his private school, I asked him about his history projects, all while carrying this massive, invisible weight in my chest. Julian was a quiet, deeply observant boy. He was sensitive, introverted, and preferred the company of his sketchbooks to the loud, aggressive sports Vance had always tried to force upon him. He did not have Vance's sharp jawline or his thick red hair. Julian had soft, dark features, a gentle slope to his shoulders, and eyes that always seemed to be analyzing the world around him. I loved him with a fierce, consuming intensity. He was my entire world. The thought of dragging him into a cold clinic to prove his own existence to his father made me physically sick. But Vance left me no choice. He threatened to freeze our accounts, to drag the accusation into a public divorce court, to humiliate us both if I did not comply. He wanted his proof. Thursday morning was overcast, the sky a bruised, heavy gray over the Pennsylvania suburbs. I drove Julian to the clinic in silence. The leather seats of my car felt like ice against my back. Julian sat in the passenger seat, his knees pulled up slightly, his fingers picking nervously at the hem of his sweater. He asked me why we had to go to a doctor when he was not sick. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I forced a gentle, reassuring smile onto my face. I told him it was just a routine screening, a new requirement for his school sports physical. The lie tasted like ash in my mouth. The genetics clinic was located in a high-end medical park. It was blindingly white, devoid of any human warmth. The walls were bare, the lighting was harsh, and the air smelled faintly of rubbing alcohol and expensive floor wax. Vance was already there, sitting in the waiting room in a sharp charcoal suit, checking his phone. He did not greet Julian, he barely looked at him. A nurse called us back. She was painfully cheerful, oblivious to the toxic radiation leaking from my husband. She handed Julian a long cotton swab and explained how to rub it against the inside of his cheek. I watched my son follow her instructions. I watched him place the swab into the sterile plastic tube. I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab his hand and run out of that building, far away from the cold, calculating man standing in the corner. But I stood still. I knew the truth. I knew the results would come back as a 99.9% match. I knew Vance would be forced to look at that paper, to realize his own paranoia, and to apologize to the family he was trying to destroy. I was so incredibly naive. The wait for the results took exactly 8 days. 8 days of suffocating silence in our home. Vance slept in the guest room. We did not speak. We merely existed in the same house, orbiting each other like dead planets. When the call finally came, the receptionist asked that both parents come into the office to discuss the findings with Dr. Eris. She did not say the results were ready. She said the doctor needed to speak with us in person. A cold spike of dread drove itself into my stomach. We sat in Dr. Eris's office on a Tuesday afternoon. The room was lined with heavy oak bookshelves and framed medical degrees. The doctor sat behind his massive desk, a man in his late 50s with tired eyes and a deeply uncomfortable posture. He had a single manila folder resting on the blotter in front of him. He did not open it immediately. He folded his hands, looked at Vance, and then looked at me. He cleared his throat and said that in his 20 years of practicing genetic medicine, he had rarely seen a case quite like this. Vance leaned forward, a smug, vindicated smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. He told the doctor to just give him the numbers. He said he already knew what they were going to say. Dr. Eris opened the folder. He looked down at the paper, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. He looked at Vance and stated, in a quiet, measured voice, that the probability of paternity was 0%. Vance let out a short, cruel laugh. He turned to me, his eyes blazing with a terrifying mixture of triumph and hatred. He asked me if I was happy now. He asked me who the father was. I could not breathe. The walls of the office seemed to rush inward. I shook my head, my voice trembling, insisting that it was impossible. I told the doctor the test was wrong. I told him there had to be a mistake in the lab, a mix-up with the samples. Dr. Eris held up a hand to stop me. His face was pale. He looked at me with an expression of profound, unsettling pity. He said the lab did not make a mistake. He said they ran the sequence 3 separate times because the anomaly was so severe. Vance snapped at him, demanding to know what anomaly he was talking about. Dr. Eris turned the paper around and slid it across the heavy oak desk toward us. He looked directly into my eyes and said that Julian was a 0% match to Vance, and then he took a slow, deep breath. He said Julian was also a 0% match to me. The silence in the room became a physical weight. It pressed down on my chest, crushing my lungs, stopping my heart. I stared at the black ink on the white paper. 0% probability of maternity. The words made no sense. They were a foreign language. They were a mathematical impossibility. I had carried Julian for 9 months. I had felt him kick against my ribs. I had endured 20 hours of agonizing labor before being rushed into an emergency surgical suite. I had the faded silver scar across my lower abdomen to prove it. I looked at the doctor, my vision blurring, the edges of the room turning black. I asked him what he meant. I asked him how a mother could not be a match to the child she gave birth to. Dr. Eris spoke softly, explaining rare medical phenomena. He mentioned chimerism, a condition where a person has 2 different sets of DNA. He mentioned the possibility of a vanishing twin in the womb. He threw out medical jargon like a lifeline, trying to rationalize the impossible. But Vance did not care about medical anomalies. Vance did not care about chimerism. Vance stood up, his chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. He looked at me with absolute disgust. He accused me of orchestrating a massive, sick cover-up. He demanded to know if I had used a secret donor egg. He demanded to know if I had arranged an illegal adoption to trap him in this marriage. I was sobbing now, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I swore to him on my life, on Julian's life, that I had no idea what was happening. I begged him to listen to the doctor, to understand that this was a medical mystery, not a betrayal. But Vance was already walking toward the door. He said he was done. He said he was contacting his lawyers in the morning, and that he was washing his hands of whatever twisted psychotic game I was playing. He walked out of the clinic, leaving me sitting in the leather chair, staring at the paper that had just erased my entire existence. The drive back to the main line was a blur of gray roads and blinding headlights. I do not remember parking the car. I do not remember walking through the front door. I only remember the sound of Vance packing. I stood in the doorway of our master bedroom. Vance was throwing designer suits and expensive watches into a large leather suitcase. He moved with a frantic, ruthless efficiency. I pleaded with him. I told him we needed to figure this out together. I told him Julian was still our son, the boy we had raised, the boy who loved him. Vance zipped the suitcase shut with a sharp, violent sound. He looked at me with eyes so cold they burned. He said Julian was not his son. He said Julian was a stranger, and I was a liar, and he was not going to spend another second of his life pretending otherwise. He walked past me, his shoulder hitting mine hard enough to knock me off balance. I followed him down the grand, sweeping staircase. I followed him to the heavy oak front door. He opened it, letting in the cold night air. He did not look back. He walked out to his car, threw his bag in the trunk, and drove away. I stood in the massive, echoing foyer of my beautiful, empty house. The silence was deafening. I slowly walked upstairs. I walked down the long hallway, my footsteps muffled by the thick, expensive carpet. I stopped outside Julian's bedroom door. It was cracked open just an inch. I could see the soft blue glow of his desk lamp. I could hear the faint scratching of his pencil against paper. I pressed my hand against the cool wood of the door. My heart shattered into a million jagged pieces. The boy in that room was my son. I had nursed him through fevers in the middle of the night. I had bandaged his scraped knees. I had held him while he cried over broken friendships. I knew the exact sound of his laugh, the specific way his hair curled at the nape of his neck when it grew too long. But the blood running through his veins was not mine. The realization was a physical agony. It was a phantom pain, a tearing sensation deep in my gut. If Julian was not mine, then where was my biological child? Where was the baby they pulled from my body 15 years ago? That night, I did not sleep. I could not lie in the massive, empty bed I had shared with a man who had abandoned us without a second thought. Instead, I went up to the attic. The air up there was stale, smelling of dry wood and old dust. The single bare bulb cast long, distorted shadows against the slanted ceiling. I pulled down the heavy plastic storage bins labeled with Julian's name. I sat on the rough wooden floorboards and tore off the lids. I dug through 15 years of memories. I found his first pair of tiny white shoes. I found the plaster cast of his handprint from kindergarten. I found his old, worn-out stuffed bear. Every object felt like a weapon. Every memory was tainted by the terrifying question of biology. I reached the bottom of the third bin. Beneath a stack of old baby blankets, I found the hospital memory box. My hands were shaking as I opened the cardboard lid. Inside was the dried stump of an umbilical cord, a tiny blue knit hat, the plastic hospital bracelet with my name printed on it, and a stack of glossy photographs. I spread the photos out on the dusty floorboards. They were taken by Vance, back when he still pretended to care. They documented the chaotic, terrifying night of my delivery. My pregnancy had been perfectly normal until the very last day. My blood pressure had spiked dangerously high. The monitors had started screaming. The doctors had rushed in, their faces grim, and told me they had to perform an emergency surgical delivery immediately. I was heavily medicated, terrified, and exhausted. I remembered the blinding lights of the operating room. I remembered the pressure, the tugging, and then the sharp, piercing cry of a baby. They had held him up over the blue surgical drape for just a second before rushing him away to the neonatal intensive care unit to be stabilized. I did not get to hold him until the next morning. I picked up a photograph taken in the recovery ward. It showed me lying in the hospital bed, pale and exhausted, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a striped blanket. I stared at the baby's face. It was Julian. It was the same soft nose, the same dark eyes. But then I looked closer. I looked past myself. I looked at the background of the photograph. The hospital room was chaotic. There were medical carts pushed against the wall. And standing in the corner, partially obscured by the edge of the frame, was a young nurse. She was looking directly at the camera. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a look of absolute, paralyzing terror. I pulled my phone from my pocket and turned on the flashlight, shining it directly onto the glossy surface of the photograph. I squinted, my heart hammering against my ribs. Right next to the terrified nurse, just barely visible in the blurred background, was the edge of a second plastic bassinet. It was pushed against the wall, half hidden behind a privacy curtain, but I could see the corner of a blue blanket. I could see the edge of a tiny, red, newborn hand. Two babies, one room, a terrified nurse. The pieces clicked together in my mind with a sickening, violent force. It was not a genetic anomaly. It was not a vanishing twin. It was a mistake. A catastrophic, unforgivable mistake made in the chaotic hours of an understaffed hospital ward. They had taken my biological son, and they had handed me someone else's child. I dropped the photograph. I pressed my hands over my mouth to muffle the scream that tore its way out of my throat. I sat in the dust of the attic and wept until my lungs burned. I wept for Julian, the beautiful boy who was about to lose his entire identity. I wept for the baby I had never known, the child who was out there in the world, living a life completely disconnected from me. When the tears finally stopped, they were replaced by something else. Something cold, hard, and terrifyingly sharp. Rage. I gathered the photographs, placed them carefully back into the box, and carried them downstairs to my home office. It was 3 a.m. The house was dead silent. I opened my laptop. The bright glow of the screen illuminated the dark room. I pulled up the digital archives of the hospital where I had given birth. It was a massive, prestigious medical center in the city. They prided themselves on their flawless reputation. I searched for staff directories from 15 years ago. I cross-referenced the faces in the old newsletters with the terrified young woman in my photograph. It took me 4 hours. My eyes burned, my back ached, but I did not stop. I scoured LinkedIn profiles, old Facebook groups for nursing alumni, and public state licensing records. Just as the sun began to rise, casting a pale, gray light through the office window, I found her. Her name was Fiona. She was no longer a nurse. According to her public records, she had let her medical license expire 14 years ago, just 1 year after I gave birth. She had completely vanished from the medical field. She had moved out of the city, far away from the hospitals and the monitors and the sterile white hallways. I found a business registration under her name. She owned a small, independent flower shop in a rural county, an hour and a half away from the manicured lawns of the main line. I did not hesitate. I did not sleep. I went upstairs, took a scalding hot shower, and put on a simple pair of jeans and a dark sweater. I left a note on the kitchen counter for Julian, telling him I had early errands to run and that I loved him. I wrote the words "I love you" 3 times, underlining them so hard the pen nearly tore the paper. I got into my car and drove. The drive took me out of the affluent suburbs and into the sprawling, overgrown roads of the rural county. The massive stone houses gave way to old farmhouses, rusted tractors, and dense, untamed woods. The flower shop was located at the end of a quiet, 2-lane road. It was a small, weathered wooden building with a faded green awning. A rusted metal bell hung above the door. I parked my car on the gravel lot. I sat behind the steering wheel for a long moment, listening to the ticking of the engine. This was the threshold. Once I walked through that door, there was no going back. The life I had known was already dead, but the truth was waiting inside that shop, ready to bury it forever. I opened the car door and stepped out into the crisp morning air. I pushed open the door to the shop. The rusted bell chimed loudly, shattering the quiet. The interior was humid and smelled overwhelmingly of eucalyptus, damp earth, and dying roses. The floor was covered in wet leaves and spilled potting soil. It was a place of quiet, messy life, the exact opposite of the sterile hospital where my nightmare began. A woman emerged from the back room, wiping her hands on a canvas apron. It was Fiona. She was older now. Her hair was streaked with gray, and deep lines of exhaustion framed her mouth. But her eyes were exactly the same. She looked at me. She offered a polite customer service smile and asked how she could help me. I did not speak. I reached into my purse, pulled out the glossy hospital photograph, and placed it face up on the wooden checkout counter. Fiona looked down at the image. I watched the blood drain completely from her face. I watched her hands begin to tremble. The polite smile vanished, replaced by the exact same look of absolute, paralyzing terror captured in the photograph 15 years ago. She took a step back, bumping into a bucket of water, sending a dozen white lilies crashing to the floor. She whispered my name. She knew exactly who I was. I placed my hands flat on the counter. I leaned in, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. I told her I knew about the 0%. I told her I knew about the second bassinet, and I told her that if she did not tell me exactly what happened that night, I would burn her entire life to the ground. Fiona collapsed. She did not fight. She did not deny it. She simply sank to her knees behind the counter, buried her face in her hands, and began to sob with the heavy, agonizing sound of a woman who had been carrying a terrible secret for a decade and a half. I walked around the counter. I stood over her, surrounded by the smell of crushed lilies and wet dirt. I demanded the truth. Fiona looked up at me, her face streaked with tears and dirt. Her voice shook violently as she spoke. She said it was chaos. She said there was a massive storm that night, a power surge that knocked out the primary monitors in the neonatal unit. They were understaffed. 3 nurses had called out sick. There were too many babies, too many alarms, screaming in the dark. She said she was exhausted. She had been working a double shift. She was carrying 2 infants back from the examination room. She said she tripped over a loose power cord in the dark. She nearly dropped them. In the panic, in the terrifying seconds of trying to catch her balance and soothe the crying infants, the identification bracelets slipped. She put them back on, but she put them on the wrong wrists. I felt the room spin. I grabbed the edge of the wooden counter to keep myself from falling. A tripped wire, a moment of panic. That was all it took to steal my child. I asked her why she did not say anything. I asked her how she could hand me a baby that did not belong to me and watch me walk out the door. Fiona choked on a sob. She said she realized the mistake 3 hours later when the morning light came through the windows and she saw the slight differences in their faces. She said she ran to the hospital administrator. She begged him to stop the discharges, to order immediate blood tests. But the administrator looked at the liability. He looked at the massive, multi-million-dollar lawsuit that would destroy the hospital's pristine reputation. He told Fiona that if she breathed a word of the mistake, he would ensure she never worked in medicine again. He told her she would be sued into absolute poverty, that she would go to prison for medical negligence. They buried it, they discharged the babies, they sealed the records, and they threatened a young, terrified nurse into silence. Fiona looked at me, her eyes begging for a forgiveness I could never give. She said she quit the next year. She said she could not look at another newborn baby without feeling physically sick. She had hidden in this flower shop, waiting for 15 years for this exact moment. I did not care about her guilt. I did not care about her ruined career. I grabbed her by the shoulders of her canvas apron and pulled her up. I looked directly into her terrified eyes. I asked her where my son was. Fiona trembled. She reached into the pocket of her apron with shaking hands. She pulled out a small, crumpled receipt pad and a pen. She pressed the paper against the wooden counter. Her hand shook so violently she could barely form the letters. She said the hospital had erased the digital files, but she had memorized the name. She had repeated it in her head every single night for 15 years, a haunting prayer for a child she had lost in the dark. She finished writing, tore the small slip of paper from the pad, and handed it to me. I looked down at the blue ink. It was a name. Roxanne Black. Fiona whispered that Roxanne was the woman in the room next to mine. She was a young, single mother from a rough neighborhood in Delaware County. I stared at the name. Roxanne Black. Somewhere out there, in a gritty row house just an hour away from my sterile, empty mansion, my biological son was waking up. He was eating breakfast. He was living a life I knew absolutely nothing about, raised by a woman who thought he was hers. The drive from Fiona's flower shop to Delaware County felt like moving underwater. I sat behind the wheel of my car, the engine humming a low, steady rhythm that felt entirely disconnected from the violent pounding in my chest. The slip of paper rested on the passenger seat. Roxanne Black. With every mile I drove away from the manicured, sprawling estates of the main line, the world outside my window began to change. The towering oak trees and pristine, sweeping driveways gave way to narrow streets and cracked pavement. The air felt heavier here. I crossed into a neighborhood of dense, brick row houses pressed tightly against one another, their small front porches cluttered with the debris of daily survival. Faded plastic toys, rusted bicycles, and sagging porch swings replaced the silent, perfectly landscaped gardens I was used to. I pulled my car to the curb in front of the address Fiona had given me. The house was narrow, the red brick weathered and darkened by decades of exhaust and rain. The front lawn was nothing more than a small patch of overgrown grass, bordered by a chain-link fence that leaned slightly to the left. I turned off the engine. The silence in the car was deafening. I looked at the house, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. Somewhere, inside those brick walls was the child I had carried for 9 months. The child I had felt kicking against my ribs in the dead of night. The child I had pushed into the world, only to have him stolen away in the chaotic, blinding lights of an emergency room. I forced my hands to let go of the wheel. I opened the car door and stepped out into the humid afternoon air. My legs felt like lead as I walked up the short concrete path to the front steps. The wooden stairs groaned under my weight. I stood before the front door, staring at the peeling white paint around the frame. I raised my hand. I knocked 3 times. The sound echoed hollowly against the wood. I waited, listening to the muffled sounds of a television playing somewhere deep inside the house. Footsteps approached the door. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. The deadbolt clicked. The door swung inward, groaning on old hinges. I stopped breathing. Standing in the doorway was not Roxanne Black. It was a boy. He was 15 years old, tall and lean, wearing a faded gray t-shirt and loose denim jeans. But it was not his clothes that made my heart stop beating. It was his face. He had thick, unruly auburn hair, the exact shade of dark red that Vance had in his 20s. His jawline was sharp, angular, and cut with the precise, cold geometry that I had stared at across a dining room table for over a decade. His eyes were a piercing, pale blue. Vance's eyes. The biological recognition hit me with the force of a physical blow. My knees went weak, and I had to grab the wooden doorframe to keep from collapsing onto the porch. This was my son. My flesh. My blood. He stood there, looking at me with a mixture of teenage boredom and mild suspicion. "Can I help you?" he asked. His voice was deep, carrying a slight, grounded grit that belonged entirely to these streets, completely devoid of the polished, restrained tone Julian had been taught to use. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. I just stared at him, drinking in the shape of his nose, the curve of his brow, the way his shoulders slouched. 15 years of missed birthdays, missed fevers, missed laughter, all rushing into my mind in a single, agonizing wave. "Who is it, Silas?" A woman's voice called out from inside the house. "Silas." His name was Silas. "I don't know," he called back over his shoulder. "Some lady in a fancy coat." Footsteps approached from the hallway, and a woman appeared behind him. She was around my age, but her face carried the deep, exhausted lines of a woman who had fought for every single thing she had ever owned. Her dark hair was pulled back into a messy knot, and she was wiping her hands on a faded dish towel. She looked at my expensive clothes, my pristine shoes, and her eyes immediately narrowed with defensive hostility. "What are you selling?" she asked, her tone flat and unwelcoming. "I am not selling anything," I managed to say, my voice trembling. "Are you Roxanne?" She stopped wiping her hands. The dish towel hung motionless from her fingers. "Who wants to know?" she asked, stepping slightly in front of Silas, a deeply ingrained maternal instinct taking over. "My name is Clara," I said, "Clara Langford. I need to speak with you. Alone." Roxanne stared at me, her dark eyes scanning my face, searching for a threat. She looked from me to the expensive car parked at her curb, and then back to my face. "Silas, go upstairs and put your headphones on," she ordered, never taking her eyes off me. "But Mom," he started to protest. "Now, Silas," she snapped, her voice leaving absolutely no room for argument. The boy rolled his eyes, turned, and stomped up the narrow wooden staircase, the floorboards creaking under his weight. Roxanne waited until the sound of a bedroom door clicking shut echoed down the hall. She turned back to me. "You have 2 minutes," she said, stepping aside just enough to let me pass. I walked into the house. The air smelled of old wood, damp earth, and strong coffee. The living room was small and cluttered, but fiercely clean. Every surface was covered with framed photographs. Photographs of Silas. Silas as a baby, Silas missing his front teeth, Silas holding a cheap plastic trophy. I felt a sickening wave of vertigo as I looked at a life I had been entirely erased from. Roxanne led me into a cramped kitchen at the back of the house. The linoleum floor was scuffed, and the refrigerator hummed with a loud, rattling vibration. She did not offer me a seat. She stood by the sink, crossing her arms over her chest. "Start talking," she said. I took a deep breath, trying to steady the violent shaking in my hands. 15 years ago, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. On the night of October 12th, we were both at St. Jude Medical Center. Roxanne's posture stiffened. "We both had emergency deliveries," I continued, forcing the words out of my throat. "We were in rooms right next to each other." "Where are you going with this?" she demanded, her voice dropping an octave, thick with sudden, rising panic. "My husband recently demanded a paternity test for my son," I said. "The son I brought home from that hospital. The son I have raised for 15 years. Roxanne did not move. She did not blink. "The test came back," I said, the tears finally spilling over my eyelashes and running down my cheeks. "He is a 0% match to my husband, and he is a 0% match to me." The rattling hum of the refrigerator seemed to fill the entire room. Roxanne's face drained of all color. Her arms dropped to her sides. "No," she whispered, taking a step back until her hips hit the edge of the kitchen counter. "No, you are crazy. Get out of my house." "Roxanne, please," I begged, taking a step toward her. I spoke to the nurse. I spoke to Fiona. She confessed. "The hospital made a mistake. They swapped our babies in the nursery, and they covered it up." "Shut up," Roxanne shouted, her voice cracking with terror. "Shut your mouth right now." She grabbed the edge of the counter, her knuckles turning white. "Silas is my boy," she hissed, her eyes wild and desperate. "I raised him. I worked 3 jobs to feed him. I sat up with him every time he was sick. He is mine." "I know he is," I cried, the agony in my chest threatening to tear me apart. "I know you raised him, but the boy I raised, the boy sitting in my empty house right now, he is yours." Roxanne squeezed her eyes shut, shaking her head violently from side to side. "No," she muttered. "No, no, no." She opened her eyes, and I saw the devastating truth swimming in the depths of them. She knew. Deep down, in the darkest, most terrifying corner of her mind, she had always known. "When Silas was 7, she whispered, her voice hollow and broken, "he needed his tonsils out. They did routine blood work." She looked down at her trembling hands. "The doctor told me his blood type was AB positive," she continued, the tears finally falling from her eyes. "I am O negative. His father, the man who walked out on us before he was even born, he was O positive." She looked up at me, her face twisted in a mask of pure, suffocating guilt. "Two O parents cannot have an AB child," she sobbed. "I looked it up on the internet. I read the articles, but I told myself the lab made a mistake. I told myself it was a typo. I buried it. I buried it because I looked at his face, and I loved him so much it hurt to breathe, and I could not let anyone take him away from me. I stepped forward, and did the only thing I could do. I wrapped my arms around her. Roxanne collapsed against my shoulder, sobbing uncontrollably, her fingers digging into the expensive fabric of my coat. We stood there in the cramped, scuffed kitchen, 2 mothers holding on to each other, united by a grief so profound and unnatural that it defied all language. We were the victims of a monstrous, clinical theft. When the tears finally slowed, we sat at her small wooden kitchen table. We agreed to a secret, independent DNA test. We needed absolute, undeniable proof before we destroyed the lives of two innocent boys. I arranged for a private courier to deliver the swab kits the next morning. The waiting was a special kind of psychological torture. For 3 days, I walked through the cavernous, silent halls of my home like a ghost. I watched Julian from afar. I watched him sit at the kitchen island, his dark hair falling over his eyes as he did his homework. I watched the gentle, quiet way he moved, the sensitive, introverted soul that I had nurtured and protected for a decade and a half. He was my son. Every fiber of my being loved him with a fierce, protective violence. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw Silas. I saw the auburn hair. I saw the sharp jawline. I felt the primal, biological tether pulling me toward the gritty streets of Delaware County. I was being torn in half, my heart split between the boy I had made and the boy I had raised. On the 4th morning, the email arrived. I sat at the heavy mahogany desk in my home office, staring at the glowing screen of my laptop. The PDF document was attached. I clicked it open. The clinical, black text filled the screen. Probability of maternity, 99.9%. Silas was my biological son. I closed the laptop, resting my forehead against the cold metal casing, and wept silently into the empty room. I printed the document. I needed to hold it in my hands. I needed to feel the weight of the paper that proved I was not crazy, that proved my entire life had been hijacked by a hospital's cowardly cover-up. I placed the printed pages inside a manila folder and left it on the corner of my desk. It was the most catastrophic mistake of my life. That afternoon, I went to the grocery store to buy ingredients for Julian's favorite dinner. I was trying to maintain a facade of normalcy, trying to hold the crumbling walls of our life together for just a few more days until I could figure out how to tell him the truth. When I returned home, the house was too quiet. The heavy front door was unlocked. I set the grocery bags on the kitchen counter and called out his name. Julian. There was no answer. I walked down the hallway, a cold knot of dread forming in my stomach. I reached the open door of my home office. Julian was standing frozen in the center of the room. The manila folder was open on the desk. He held the original paternity test in his left hand, the one Vance had demanded. He held the new maternity test in his right hand, the one proving Silas was my son. Julian looked up at me. His face was completely devoid of color. His dark eyes were wide, filled with a terror and a heartbreak so absolute it made me stop breathing. Julian, I whispered, taking a step toward him. Sweetheart, please, let me explain. He took a step back, holding the papers up like a shield. 0%, he said, his voice cracking, sounding like a small, frightened child. Julian, please, I begged, reaching my hands out to him. You are not my mother, he whispered, the tears spilling over his cheeks. He is not my father. I am nobody. I do not belong here. You are my son, I cried, rushing toward him. Do not touch me, he screamed, a sound of pure, raw agony tearing from his throat. He dropped the papers onto the floor. He turned and bolted from the room. I chased him down the hallway, screaming his name, but he was too fast. He threw open the front door and ran out into the fading afternoon light. He grabbed his bicycle from the side of the garage, pedaling furiously down the long, sweeping driveway. I ran to my car, my hands shaking so violently I dropped my keys twice before I could unlock the door. I started the engine and threw it into gear, but by the time I reached the main road, he was gone. He had vanished into the maze of suburban streets. I pulled over to the shoulder, my heart hammering against my ribs. I pulled out my phone and opened the tracking app we had installed on his phone years ago. The small blue dot was moving rapidly toward the local train station. He was heading into the city. He was going to Vance. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, breaking every speed limit as I raced toward downtown Philadelphia. Vance had rented a luxury penthouse apartment in the financial district the day he walked out on us. He had claimed he needed space to process my supposed betrayal. I navigated the heavy city traffic, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, praying I would reach the building before Julian did. I pulled up to the towering glass high-rise, abandoning my car in a loading zone. I ran through the sliding glass doors into the pristine, marble-floored lobby. The concierge looked up, startled by my frantic appearance. "My husband," I gasped, out of breath. "Vance Langford, Penthouse 4. Did my son just go up there?" The concierge hesitated, looking at his computer screen. "A young man matching that description went up in the elevator about 5 minutes ago, ma'am," he said. I did not wait for him to finish. I ran to the elevator bank and slammed my hand against the call button. The ride to the top floor felt like an eternity. The metal doors slid open, revealing a quiet, softly lit hallway lined with expensive modern art. I ran down the hall toward Penthouse 4. The heavy oak door was slightly ajar. I could hear voices inside. I pushed the door open and stepped into the massive, open-concept living room. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the city skyline. Julian was standing in the center of the room, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his face pale and streaked with tears. Vance stood a few feet away, wearing a tailored suit, holding a crystal glass of amber liquor. But Vance was not alone. Sitting on the sleek white leather sofa was a young woman. She was no older than 25, with long blonde hair and perfect, unblemished skin. She was wearing a silk robe. She looked entirely comfortable, entirely at home. The apartment was fully furnished. There were framed photos of Vance and the young woman on the bookshelves, photos taken on beaches, photos taken in Paris, photos that clearly spanned years. The truth hit me with the force of a freight train. Vance had not left because of the paternity test. He had not been shocked by the results. He had been planning this exit for years. He had been living a double life, funneling money into this penthouse, building a new reality with this woman. The paternity test was nothing but a calculated, cowardly weapon. He had used it to manufacture a betrayal, to paint me as the villain, to secure a divorce where he could walk away without paying alimony, without paying child support, without taking any responsibility for the family he was abandoning. He had used a technicality he somehow suspected, or perhaps just hoped for, to destroy us. Julian stared at the young woman on the couch, and then looked back at Vance. "Dad," Julian whispered, his voice trembling, "please, I do not know what is happening. Mom has papers. They say I am not yours, but I am your son. Please, let me stay here tonight." Vance took a slow sip of his drink. His face was a mask of cold, clinical indifference. He looked at Julian not as a son, but as a minor inconvenience. "Julian," Vance said, his voice smooth and entirely devoid of emotion, "you need to go back to Clara. You are not my biological child. You are not my responsibility anymore." The cruelty of the words hung in the air, sharp and venomous. Julian flinched as if he had been struck across the face. His shoulders collapsed. The light completely died in his eyes. "Vance," I screamed, stepping out from the entryway. Vance looked at me, a faint, arrogant smirk playing on his lips. "Ah, Clara," he said smoothly. "Come to collect your mess." I ignored him. I ran to Julian and grabbed his arm. "Julian, look at me," I pleaded. "We are leaving. Right now." Julian did not fight me. He was completely hollowed out. He let me lead him out of the apartment, down the silent hallway, and into the elevator. We did not speak a single word on the drive back to the suburbs. The silence in the car was suffocating, heavy with the weight of a shattered reality. When we finally arrived back at the empty, echoing mansion, Julian walked straight up the stairs. He went into his bedroom. The heavy wooden door slammed shut. The deadbolt clicked into place. I walked up the stairs and stood outside his door. "Julian," I said softly, resting my forehead against the cool wood. There was no answer. I slid down the door until I was sitting on the hardwood floor in the hallway. I pulled my knees to my chest. "Julian, please listen to me," I whispered, the tears falling freely now. "Biology is just a word. It is just science. It does not mean anything." I heard the faint sound of him crying on the other side of the door. "I was there when you took your first steps," I said, my voice breaking. "I was there when you broke your arm falling out of the oak tree. I stayed awake with you for 3 nights when you had pneumonia. You are my son. You will always be my son." Nothing in this world will ever change that. The heavy, agonizing silence stretched on. He did not open the door. He did not speak. He was spiraling into a dark, terrifying depression, feeling like an imposter in his own life, rejected by the man he thought was his father, and alienated from the woman he thought was his mother. I sat on the floor outside his room for hours. The sun set, plunging the hallway into deep shadows. The house was entirely silent, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock downstairs. I felt completely powerless. My family had been dismantled piece by piece. It was past midnight when the silence was finally broken. My cell phone vibrated in my coat pocket. I pulled it out, the bright screen blinding me in the dark hallway. It was a phone call. The caller ID displayed a name I had saved just a few days ago. Roxanne Black. I swiped the screen and pressed the phone to my ear. "Hello," I whispered, not wanting to wake Julian. "Clara!" Roxanne screamed into the phone. Her voice was entirely unrecognizable. It was a raw, guttural shriek of pure, unadulterated terror. "Roxanne, what is wrong?" I asked, scrambling to my feet, my heart instantly hammering in my throat. "It is Silas," she sobbed, the sound of chaotic movement echoing in the background. "What happened?" I demanded, rushing down the stairs. "He collapsed," she cried, her breath coming in ragged, panicked gasps. I heard a crash in the bathroom. I broke the door down. "He is on the floor, Clara." "Roxanne, call an ambulance," I shouted, grabbing my car keys from the kitchen counter. "I already did," she screamed, the sound of sirens wailing faintly in the distance through the phone. "Clara, there is so much blood." "Blood," I repeated, my blood running cold. "He was coughing," she sobbed hysterically. "He was coughing up blood into the sink. He is completely pale. He is not waking up. Clara, he is not waking up." I told her to hold on, that I was already out the door, and I threw my phone onto the passenger seat. The engine of my car roared to life, shattering the quiet perfection of my manicured suburban street. I tore out of the driveway, my tires screaming against the cold asphalt. The drive from the main line to the hospital in Delaware County was a terrifying blur of streetlights and blind panic. I do not remember stopping at red lights or navigating the winding roads. I only remember the suffocating grip of terror tightening around my chest. My biological son, a boy I had only just met, was bleeding out in a bathroom I had never seen. The emergency room was a chaotic labyrinth of harsh fluorescent lights and the relentless rhythmic beeping of medical monitors. It smelled of industrial bleach, stale coffee, and human desperation. I found Roxanne huddled in a hard plastic chair in the corner of the waiting area. She looked incredibly small, her knees pulled up to her chest. Her tough, working-class armor, the fierce defensiveness she had worn since the moment I knocked on her door, had completely vanished. She was just a mother, entirely broken by the agonizing weight. I sat down next to her, and without a single word, she leaned her head against my shoulder and wept. I wrapped my arm around her trembling frame. In that sterile, unforgiving room, the boundaries of wealth, class, and biology dissolved into nothing. We were simply two women terrified of losing the same boy. Hours bled into one another before a doctor finally approached us. His name was Dr. Eris. He had deep, exhausted shadows under his eyes, and a voice that was far too calm for the nightmare he was about to deliver. He guided us into a small, windowless consultation room away from the chaos of the emergency floor. Dr. Eris asked us to sit down. He folded his hands on the desk and looked directly at us. He explained that Silas was stable for the moment, but his blood counts were dangerously, catastrophically low. "He is suffering from severe aplastic anemia," the doctor said, his words hanging in the air like a toxic cloud. He explained that the bone marrow inside Silas had simply stopped producing enough new blood cells. His body was failing to create the red cells needed to carry oxygen, the white cells needed to fight infection, and the platelets needed to stop bleeding. Roxanne shook her head, her voice cracking as she asked how this could happen to a healthy 15-year-old boy. Dr. Eris sighed softly. He explained that while it is a rare condition, it often carries a strong genetic component. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The air vanished from my lungs. My mind raced back decades to my maternal grandmother, who had passed away from a mysterious, aggressive blood disorder when I was a very young child. This was my fault. The genetics were mine. The flawed, failing marrow inside that boy was an inheritance from my bloodline. But the guilt went far deeper than biology. If Silas had been raised with me, if he had my accurate medical history on file, his pediatricians would have been screening his blood counts for years. They would have caught the subtle warning signs. They would have intervened before he was coughing up blood into a bathroom sink. Because of the hospital's malicious cover-up, because of a swapped crib 15 years ago, Silas had been deprived of his own medical history. He had been walking around with a ticking time bomb in his blood, and neither of his mothers had any idea. Dr. Aris continued, his voice cutting through my spiraling thoughts. He told us that Silas needed a bone marrow transplant to survive. Blood transfusions and medications could only buy him a little bit of time. Without a transplant, his body would simply give out. Roxanne immediately rolled up her sleeve. "Take mine," she demanded, her voice fierce and desperate. "Take whatever he needs right now." Dr. Aris looked at her with profound sympathy. He gently explained that a bone marrow donor must be a close genetic match. Because Roxanne was not his biological mother, the chances of her being a match were virtually zero. Roxanne froze, her arm still extended. The cruel reality of the DNA test we had taken just days ago came crashing down on her all over again. She covered her face with her hands, a hollow, devastating sob escaping her throat. I stood up from my chair. "Test me," I said, my voice steady and absolute. "I am his biological mother. Test me right now." The next 24 hours were a blur of needles, blood draws, and agonizing waiting. I was admitted as a patient, moving through the sterile corridors of the hospital like a ghost. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Silas collapsing. I saw the 15 years I had missed, the birthdays, the scraped knees, the quiet moments of childhood that had been stolen from us. While we waited for the compatibility results, I sat by Silas in the intensive care unit. He was unconscious, hooked up to a terrifying array of machines and intravenous lines. His skin was translucent, his vibrant red hair stark against the stark white hospital pillows. He looked so much like Vance. The sharp jawline, the slope of his nose, the exact shape of his brow. It was a cruel irony that the man who had abandoned us, the man who had demanded a paternity test to escape his own family, was stamped so clearly on the face of the son fighting for his life. Roxanne sat on the other side of the bed. She held his pale, limp hand in hers, stroking his knuckles with her thumb. She whispered stories to him, recounting memories of their life in Delaware County, reminding him of the neighborhood stray dog he had adopted, the time he fixed her broken radiator, the quiet strength he had always possessed. I listened in silence, absorbing every detail of the boy I did not know. I was his mother by blood, but she was the mother who had built him. I felt a profound, overwhelming gratitude toward her. She had loved my son with everything she had, protecting him in a world that had not been kind to them. On the evening of the second day, Dr. Aris returned with the results. I held my breath, my fingernails digging into the palms of my hands. He looked at his clipboard, then looked up at me with a small, tired smile. "You are a match, Clara," he said softly. "You are a haploidentical match. A half match, which is exactly what we need for a parent-to-child transplant. We can proceed." I collapsed into the nearest chair, burying my face in my hands as tears of pure, unadulterated relief poured down my cheeks. Roxanne rushed over to me, wrapping her arms around my shoulders. "Thank you," she kept whispering, over and over again. "Thank you for saving my boy." I looked up at her, my vision blurred with tears. "He is our boy, Roxanne," I said. "He is our boy, and I am not going to let him die." The preparation for the transplant required Silas to undergo a grueling regimen of conditioning therapy. They had to use radiation and chemotherapy to completely wipe out his failing immune system and his diseased bone marrow. It was a brutal, agonizing process to witness. He was constantly nauseous, exhausted, and in pain. His vibrant red hair began to fall out in clumps on his pillow. Roxanne and I took turns shaving his head, trying to make a joke out of it, trying to hide our own terror behind brave, maternal smiles. During this agonizing week, I realized I needed to bring Julian to the hospital. Julian had been locked in his room at my house, hollowed out by Vance's cruel rejection and the devastating revelation that he was a 0% match to the only family he had ever known. Julian felt like an imposter in his own life. He felt entirely unmoored, drifting in a sea of betrayal. I knew that keeping him isolated was only deepening his depression. He needed to see the reality of what was happening. He needed to know that he was still a vital part of this shattered family. I drove home on a Tuesday morning to get him. The massive suburban house felt like a tomb. The silence was deafening, a stark contrast to the chaotic hum of the hospital. I knocked softly on Julian's bedroom door and let myself in. He was lying on his bed, staring blankly at the ceiling. He looked so thin, so fragile. I sat on the edge of his mattress and gently placed my hand on his leg. "Julian," I said quietly, "I need you to come with me. Silas is very sick. He is going to have a bone marrow transplant, and I am going to be the donor." Julian slowly turned his head to look at me. His dark eyes, so different from my own, were filled with a complex mixture of fear, curiosity, and profound sadness. He did not say a word, but he sat up and reached for his shoes. The drive back to the hospital was silent. I did not push him to talk. I simply let the reality of the situation settle over him. When we arrived, I walked him down the long, sterile corridors toward the pediatric intensive care unit. I stopped outside Silas's room. Roxanne was inside, adjusting the blankets around Silas's sleeping form. I turned to Julian and took both of his hands in mine. "Listen to me, Julian," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "Biology did not make you my son. I made you my son. I chose you every single day for 15 years, and I will choose you every single day for the rest of my life. You are my child. Nothing in this room changes that." Julian swallowed hard, a single tear escaping and tracking down his cheek. He nodded slowly. I pushed the heavy wooden door open, and we walked inside. Silas was awake. He looked exhausted, his skin pale and his eyes sunken, but he turned his head as we entered. Roxanne stood up, her eyes darting nervously between the two boys. This was the moment. The collision of two lives that had been violently derailed by a hospital's negligence. The boy I had raised, and the boy I had birthed, staring at each other across a sterile hospital room. Julian stood awkwardly at the foot of the bed. He shoved his hands deep into the pockets of his hoodie. Silas looked at him, his gaze sharp and assessing, carrying that street-smart edge he had developed growing up in Delaware County. "Hey," Silas rasped, his voice weak but steady. "Hey," Julian replied quietly. The silence, one boy who had lost his biological family to a lie, and another boy who had lost his life of privilege to the exact same lie. "I hear you are getting my mom's bone marrow," Julian said, his voice trembling slightly. Silas managed a weak, crooked smile. "Yeah," he said. "Guess we are going to be blood relatives after all." It was a small, fragile bridge, built over a massive canyon of trauma, but it was enough. Julian pulled up a chair next to the bed, and for the first time in weeks, I saw the tension begin to leave his shoulders. The day of the transplant arrived with a heavy, suffocating gravity. I was taken to an operating room early in the morning. The procedure to extract the bone marrow from my pelvic bone was done under general anesthesia. When I woke up in the recovery room, my lower back throbbed with a deep, aching pain, but the physical discomfort was entirely eclipsed by a profound, spiritual relief. I had given my son the very core of my life force. I had finally been able to protect him. They brought the harvested marrow to Silas's room in a specialized bag. It looked remarkably like a standard blood transfusion. Roxanne and I stood on either side of his bed, holding our breath as the nurse connected the line to his central port. We watched as the thick, red fluid began to slowly drip into his bloodstream. It was the quietest, most monumental moment of my life. I was watching my own biology cross the room to save the child I had been denied. Roxanne reached across the bed and took my hand. Her grip was incredibly strong. We stood there for hours, united by the steady, rhythmic dripping of the IV line, two mothers silently praying to whatever universe was listening. The recovery process was a grueling marathon. We had to wait weeks to see if Silas's body would accept the new marrow, to see if the grafted cells would begin producing healthy blood. During those long, agonizing weeks in the hospital, I began a different kind of war. While Silas fought for his life in the sterile confines of the intensive care unit, I contacted the most ruthless, high-powered medical malpractice firm in Philadelphia. I was not going to let the hospital destroy our lives and simply walk away. I met with a team of sharp, aggressive attorneys in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the city. I handed them the DNA results from the private clinic. I handed them the medical records detailing Silas's genetic condition. And most importantly, I handed them the recorded confession from Fiona, the former neonatal nurse I had tracked down to that damp, eucalyptus-scented flower shop. I played the audio for the lawyers. They listened in stunned silence as Fiona's tearful voice detailed the chaotic night, the accidental swap, and the hospital administrator's chilling order to cover it up. When the recording ended, the lead attorney, a woman named Sarah with piercing eyes and a predatory smile, looked at me across the table. She told me we had them dead to rights. She told me we were going to burn their administration to the ground. The hospital's legal team panicked the moment our lawsuit was filed. They knew the explosive nature of the evidence. They knew that a public trial would destroy their reputation, cost them millions in funding, and likely lead to criminal charges for the administrators involved in the cover-up. They requested an emergency mediation session. They wanted to handle this quietly. They wanted to make it disappear, just like they had tried to make my biological son disappear 15 years ago. I walked into the mediation room in downtown Philadelphia wearing a sharp, tailored suit. I felt a cold, absolute clarity. Roxanne sat beside me, looking uncomfortable in the opulent surroundings, but radiating a fierce, protective anger. The hospital sent a team of corporate lawyers in expensive suits. They sat across the polished mahogany table, looking nervous and defensive. Their lead counsel, a man who reminded me entirely too much of Vance's clinical arrogance, cleared his throat and slid a thick folder across the table. He offered his deepest sympathies for the unfortunate administrative error that occurred 15 years ago. He used sterile corporate language to describe the destruction of two families. Then, he offered a settlement of $10 million. He explained that the money would cover all of Silas's medical expenses, provide a trust for both boys, and ensure that Roxanne and I were financially secure for the rest of our lives. There was only one condition. We had to sign a strict non-disclosure agreement. We had to promise never to speak of the swap, never to name the hospital, and never to tell our story to the press. They wanted my silence. They wanted to buy their way out of accountability. I looked at the settlement document. $10 million was a staggering amount of money. It would change Roxanne's life forever. It would guarantee the boys' futures. But as I looked at the signature line, a deep, righteous fury boiled up inside my chest. I pushed the folder back across the polished wood. I looked the lead attorney dead in the eyes. "Keep your money," I said, my voice cold and unwavering. "I am not signing your gag order. I am not going to let you hide in the dark. We are going to trial, and I am going to make sure every single mother in this city knows exactly what you did." The attorney blanched. He tried to backtrack, offering to increase the financial compensation, warning me about the emotional toll of a public trial. I stood up from the table, signaling that the meeting was over. Roxanne stood up right beside me, her chin held high. We walked out of the room without looking back. The trial preparation was exhausting, but it gave me a profound sense of purpose. I spent my days at the hospital with Silas and Julian, and my nights reviewing legal briefs and preparing for testimony. During this time, Vance finalized our divorce from afar. He never once visited the hospital. He never once asked to meet Silas. He was entirely consumed by his own cowardly exit, hiding behind his lawyers and his younger mistress. He sent a courier to the hospital with the final divorce papers. I signed them on a plastic tray table next to Silas's bed. I felt absolutely nothing for Vance anymore. He had become a ghost in his own life, a pathetic, irrelevant footnote in the story of our family. He had demanded a paternity test to prove his legacy, and in doing so, he had lost everything that actually mattered. The trial began in the late fall. The courtroom was packed with journalists, legal observers, and curious onlookers. The story of the swapped babies and the hospital's malicious cover-up had become a massive media sensation. Taking the witness stand was one of the hardest things I have ever done. I had to recount the suffocating silence of my marriage, the devastating shock of the 0% DNA match, and the agonizing realization that my biological son had been living in poverty while I raised a stranger in luxury. But the turning point of the trial was Fiona's testimony. The former nurse took the stand, trembling and pale. Under oath, she recounted the exact events of that chaotic night 15 years ago. She named the administrators who had threatened her license. She detailed the systematic erasure of the medical records. Her testimony was a devastating blow to the hospital's defense. The jury wept as she spoke. The corporate lawyers sitting at the defense table looked utterly defeated. We did not just win the lawsuit, we secured a historic, unprecedented verdict. The jury awarded us a massive financial judgment, far exceeding the hospital's initial settlement offer. But more importantly, the verdict triggered a statewide investigation into the hospital's administrative practices. The executives responsible for the cover-up were forced to resign, and several faced criminal indictment. We had torn their institution down to the studs. We had ensured that no other mother would ever have to endure the nightmare we had lived. As the legal war concluded, the medical war finally began to turn in our favor. Silas's body accepted the bone marrow transplant. His blood counts slowly, miraculously began to rise. The color returned to his cheeks. The agonizing fatigue began to lift. The day Dr. Aris told us Silas was officially in remission, Roxanne and I collapsed into each other's arms in the hospital hallway, sobbing with a joy so profound it felt like a physical weight being lifted from our souls. The transition back to normal life was slow and delicate. We did not try to force the two families into a traditional mold. We knew that our reality was far too complex for simple labels. I used a portion of the settlement money to buy a beautiful, sprawling property in a quiet, wooded suburb, halfway between the main line and Delaware County. It had two separate, fully equipped houses on the same lot. I lived in one with Julian. Roxanne lived in the other with Silas. We shared a massive backyard. We shared dinners. We shared the messy, beautiful, complicated reality of raising two teenage boys. Tayot played, Tayot poe, Tayot pulled, Tayot pod, blood, and an unbreakable brotherhood. Julian and Silas became inseparable. They were a study in contrasts. Julian was quiet, analytical, and deeply sensitive. Silas was loud, fiercely protective, and street smart. But they balanced each other perfectly. They understood each other's pain in a way that no one else ever could. Months later, the harsh winter melted into a vibrant, blooming spring. The air was crisp and smelled of fresh earth and new beginnings. Roxanne and I sat side by side on a weathered wooden bench at the edge of our shared property. The sky above us was a brilliant, breathtaking canvas of bruised purple and burnt orange as the sun began to set. We held steaming mugs of tea, watching in comfortable silence as Julian and Silas played basketball on the driveway court we had built for them. The rhythmic thud of the basketball against the pavement was a comforting, steady heartbeat in the quiet evening air. Silas drove toward the hoop, his red hair catching the fading sunlight. Julian blocked him, laughing as Silas faked a pass and sank a perfect layup. They bumped shoulders, a casual, effortless display of affection between two brothers who had found each other in the dark. Roxanne took a sip of her tea and sighed, a deep, contented sound. She looked at me, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "They are good boys, Clara," she said softly. I smiled, watching Julian retrieve the ball and pass it back to Silas. "Yes, they are," I replied. I leaned back against the bench, letting the cool evening breeze wash over me. I thought about the sterile clinic, the devastating DNA results, the terrifying nights in the intensive care unit, and the ruthless battles in the courtroom. I thought about the 15 years of lies, and the beautiful, unconventional truth we had built from the wreckage. Motherhood is not a biological absolute. It is not a percentage on a laboratory report. It is not defined by a swab of DNA or a matching blood type. Motherhood is the terrifying, agonizing, beautiful choice to stay. It is the willingness to bleed for a child, to fight for them, to tear down institutions for them, and to love them fiercely when everything else falls apart. I looked at the two boys laughing under the sunset sky, and then I looked at the woman sitting beside me. We had lost the lives we thought we were supposed to have. But in the end, we had found exactly what we needed. We were a family. And for the first time in my life, I knew that nothing could ever break us again.